Well, thank you all. Welcome back. We're going to get started with a fireside chat with two of our inaugural UC Berkeley Tech Policy Fellows. You might have seen on the agenda we were to have Mike Isaac from the New York Times. However, he was unable to make it. And so we are actually very, very excited to have our two fellows. So if you could please have your seat, I'll introduce both of you. And then also to let you know, those are fresh waters.
Oh, perfect. Thank you.
Okay. We've noticed nobody's drinking their water. They are fresh. We're not sharing. It's okay. Yes. So let me first introduce Yoel Roth. Yoel is a former head of trust and safety at Twitter, now wearing many hats, teaching at UPenn, but somehow still living in the Bay Area. Like your frequent flyer miles must be.
It's not worth it. I thought it would be, but it's so not.
Right. And then we also have Shankar, Siva Kumar, who is a data cowboy at Microsoft. However, any remarks that he gives today do not reflect his employer, but himself as a fellow at the UC Berkeley Tech Policy Fellowship Program. And so with that, I will pass it on to them to engage in discussion.
Oh, perfect. Thank you. Thanks, everybody. I first want to ask, how many of you are on social media? Like Twitter, everything? How many? Oh, yeah, X, formerly known as X. No, I love it. But you know, we all kind of like encounter some sort of unsavory comments. You know, we all have these uncomfortable situations where we have to be like, mute this person. One of the things that I got excited when Brandy's like, oh, you get to play Oprah for Yoel. I was like, fantastic. Because for those who don't know Yoel, I think my favorite way to introduce him in a very like gut-wrenching aspect is Yoel wrote this wonderful New York Times opinion op-ed. He called it, Trump attacked me, then Musk did. It was not an accident. So, Yoel, what happened, man?
Yeah, so I got my start as an academic researcher. So I have a PhD in communication. And about 15 years ago, back when smartphones were a brand new thing and we were just kind of figuring out what all of this would look like, I got interested in this question of who gets to decide what's allowed on social media and what isn't. And I was studying it in the context of dating apps, which I was an active user of. And you know, it seemed like there were a lot of unanswered and maybe unanswerable questions in that context. And at some point along the line, I made a series of really terrible mistakes that took me from the quiet life of an academic to working at Twitter here in San Francisco, where over the years, I had a number of different jobs on the policy team, setting rules, enforcing them, and then ultimately serving as the company's head of trust and safety up until November of 2022. But during that time, there were sort of a couple of big moments for me personally, but then I think also for the field of trust and safety. One of them was the 2020 election. In 2020, a lot of tech platforms, Twitter included, were introducing new measures for addressing the spread of disinformation, coordinated manipulation, and also lies and misinformation about the election process. And in my role as, at the time, the head of site integrity, I oversaw the team that made Twitter's policies about misinformation. And one fateful day in 2020, there came a post from the then president that violated the rules that we had written. And we examined it, we read it carefully, we looked at the facts, we examined it from every possible angle, and came to the conclusion that there was nothing we could do but enforce our rules. And so we did. And the reaction was almost immediate. The next morning, White House senior advisor Kellyanne Conway was on Fox News saying, and I'll never forget this, somebody should wake Yoel up. He's about to have a lot more followers. And then she spelled out my Twitter handle. And I did indeed have a lot more Twitter followers, which is not all it's cracked up to be. Later on, the president of the United States weighed in. He called me a hater, which remains my favorite way to have been described publicly.
But you now have a moniker, yes.
It's true. It's
Yeah.
true. Um, and and so I mention all of this because in that moment, the strategy seemed really clear, right? Even as I was sort of in the midst of the biggest personal crisis that I had ever experienced, a crisis I would never wish on anyone, it felt like what was happening then was meant to not just influence my decision making, but the decision making of my employer. It was meant to dissuade Twitter from fact checking the president of the United States ever again. It didn't work. We continued to do this work. We fact checked not just the president, but thousands of other accounts, hundreds of thousands of times over the course of the 2020 election. And really, up until 2022, when Elon Musk bought Twitter, we continued to have policies addressing harmful misinformation in place. Then the next big thing happened. In 2022,
Pandemic. No.
so, I mean, there was also in the midst of all of this, the COVID pandemic, a ton of evolution and change there, a ton of pressure on platforms to moderate differently. We can talk about all of that. But the story that I told in the Times op-ed that Ram mentioned was really looking at these sort of two moments for me personally. First, of having been attacked by Trump because of Twitter's decisions to fact check him. And then the second time around, being attacked very publicly by Elon Musk following my decision to resign from Twitter. What I really reflected on was how fragile this field that I've been studying and working in for 15 years really was. When we think about trust and safety and tech governance and policy, the fact that there's so many of us in this room makes it feel like a very robust discipline and an area of practice that must exist. But I wanted us to remember and to consider that it is under constant attack by people who would prefer that companies didn't moderate, by people who would prefer to reshape the internet in their own image. And at the core of it are people doing this work. I had the privilege to be one of those people at Twitter. There's a number of other current and former trust and safety practitioners in this room. But really the lesson for me and what I've been wrestling with for the last year and a half is, how do we make that field less vulnerable? How do we take away some of the opportunity for attack and precariousness and turn trust and safety into something that must exist and is not quite as vulnerable to the attacks that I faced? And that's an uphill battle, but it's been the one that I've been focused on for the last year and a half.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because you mentioned how a lot of this crisis spun out in 2020. You know, there was like disinformation, misinformation, lies about election. And I love how you said this is a fragile field that's constantly under attack. 2024, election year, are you feeling deja vu all over again?
You know, I've described it sometimes as a pendulum that seems to swing between two extremes. And ahead of the 2016 elections in the United States, it felt like the pendulum was a little too far to the end of the spectrum of platforms being unprepared. And then we screwed it up. Collectively, we got it wrong in 2016. We missed major nation state interference efforts in American elections, in Brexit, in elections around the world. And it was too late, but platforms got the message and they fixed it. They invested significantly in trust and safety. Meta said they hired tens of thousands of people to do this work. Like, the industry reacted and did better. And I think 2020 represented a peak. It represented what it looks like for companies to have invested as robustly as they ever had in this space. And broadly speaking, the 2020 election was the most secure social media election that we have seen. And now the pendulum is swinging back in the other direction. And as we look ahead to a year where more than 3 billion people are going to go to the polls globally, I worry that almost universally tech companies have reduced the staff doing this work, that they've watered down their policies, that I hate to pick on Meta, but I inevitably have to, that Meta have introduced the ability to turn off fact checks on Facebook and Instagram. You can just opt out of having misinformation fact checked. These are reactions to the kind of pressure campaigns that I faced from Trump and from Elon Musk. But unfortunately, we're now seeing what those effects look like in a year when the stakes couldn't be higher. And so it is deja vu, but not for 2020. It's deja vu for 2016.
And one of the interesting pieces that you published recently was trying to decentralize and federate this. could you talk a little bit about that? I want to pull the thread on that and try to reflect that as almost an antidote for what we're seeing now.
Yeah, one of the big, let's be optimistic for a minute. I try to not just dwell on the negative. So 3 billion people voting might be a mess. That's a negative. A positive is that in the midst of all of the changes at Twitter, we're starting to see innovation in the social media space for the first time in over a decade. We're seeing a number of new entrants in this marketplace. We're seeing platforms like Mastodon and Blue Sky. We're even seeing, Meta offer their own alternative in Threads. And that's exciting to me. I think that's suggesting a future of social media that could look meaningfully different than it has in this sort of very top-down controlled way that we've seen for the last 10 years. But I got kind of interested in the question of, well, what does trust and safety look like in an environment of this kind of rapid innovation and development? And so over the last year, I've been leading a research project based at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and I've been working on it here as a fellow. And what we found has been a little bit disheartening, which is that in nearly every measurable way, these new social media platforms that have come out are less secure and less safe than the centralized platforms that came before them. So we've had this moment of innovation, but we've ended up moving backwards. And we've landed with platforms that are less able to moderate themselves, that have less robust and transparent governance, and that have less built out institutions for addressing online safety risks and harms. And so where do we stand? We stand at a moment when, again, there's lots of exciting work happening, but unfortunately, it feels like we're missing an opportunity to actually build a meaningfully safer internet. I think the opportunity remains for us to do that work, but the research that I've been doing over the last year suggests that it's perhaps a bit more vulnerable than we would hope.
Yeah, and I really love how you kind of mentioned that, because one of the top things in people's mind is like misinformation. I'm going to tread it to my second, I'm going to switch the gears a little bit. This is the year of elections. 84 elections are going to happen. And I would love for you to tell me, what do you think about the role of AI in this? Do you fear it? Do you think it's going to aid it? Do you think it's going to provide more clarity? We heard about, you can pay 11 Labs $10 and you can fake Joe Biden's voice. You can make Trump look like he's standing next to black people and partying.
I saw that one.
Yeah. So what's the future for us?
Yeah, this is not a novel observation. I'm sure it's one shared by many in this room. But when I think of the current moment we're in with AI, there's some genuinely new technology, and Ram, you know this better than nearly anyone. But really, what we've seen is the democratization of a lot of these technologies. Right? We saw the ability to produce deepfake videos years ago. Right? In 2019, we started having a lot of conversations about deepfakes and cheap fakes and manipulated media. But now we're seeing the sort of equal access and lower barrier to entry of a lot of these technologies. And I think that's where we start to see change. So it's not necessarily that the threat landscape has shifted dramatically, but we're just seeing it become a lot more accessible. It's now the case that for $10, you can produce something that sounds plausibly like the President of the United States. And that does change things a little bit. I also, again, in the spirit of trying to be optimistic, I think there are opportunities here for defenders. I think certainly AI's possibility to change the threat landscape is significant, but we're seeing a lot of companies start to consider what it looks like to strategically and responsibly deploy AI for trust and safety. We're in the early days. I don't know that we yet have clear data on how effective AI-aided systems are for moderation. We don't really know how good they're going to be at dealing with the nuances of political misinformation or in-group speech or, let's be real, things in languages other than English. But we're seeing a lot of excitement and investment there. And I think potentially, if we see not just threat actors employing AI, but also defenders, there's considerable possibility there.
Yeah, and the point about defenders is particularly interesting. I'm, hearkening back to our morning panel with Stuart Russell. He kind of said like, oh, you just hire smart people to find things and then you ignore their findings. That's becoming the definition of red teaming. What does it mean for you? Like, if there's a defender, um, like what does it mean to do defense in the space? And one of the things that I loved about our fellowship is just getting access to experts like you who've like bear the scars of trust and safety. I knew nothing about trust and safety. So this has been my introduction. Tell me first a little bit more, first starting with history of trust and safety, and juxtapose it for me with what does it mean to be a defender?
Oof. I feel like I can't answer this question except by hyping the class that I'm teaching at the moment. So
It's a plug.
yes, so I have had the privilege this year of, in addition to being here at Berkeley, also getting to teach a new course at Penn that specifically is looking at trust and safety and internet governance practices. And in it, I ask my students to think back to some of the earliest days of not even the internet, but of just networked technology, and to think about what it looked like to govern, online bulletin board systems and chat rooms and communities like Lambda Mu. I asked them to construct a theory of what harms are online. If you're just chatting with somebody in text, what does harm mean in that context? And then to reflect critically on how far we've actually come in the intervening 3 or 4 decades. And so I say all that as trust and safety is actually, all things considered, a really new discipline. When I first started studying these topics about 15 years ago, the only company to have a team called Trust and Safety was eBay. And it was primarily focused on fraud. They were mostly dealing with things like scammers who were trying to offer counterfeit products. And if you fast forward 15 years, trust and safety is now much more institutionalized and professionalized than it ever has been. There are organizations like the Trust and Safety Professionals Association that brings together the thousands of people working in this field. We have industry codes of practice and standards for how we do this work. And so we have come a long way. But at its core, trust and safety is about the identification and the mitigation of online harms. This recognition that through the new technologies that we have that connect us, there's ways you can use them for amazing good, and there's also ways that they can be used to cause harm to others and for people to cause harm to themselves. And trust and safety is the work of trying to make it easier for people to do the good stuff and harder to do the bad stuff, which is a segue into what I've been dying to ask you, which is, in many ways, I think the affinities between red teaming as a set of practices and trust and safety run quite deep and relate to how do we make it harder for malign actors to do what they are trying to do. I would love to hear you reflect on that, right? Like, how do you think of malign actors in the AI space? How do you think of who your adversaries are? And how do you think of trying to counteract them?
Totally. When I started the AI Red Team back in like 2018, we went around like a tin cup. We were like, hey, can we come and red team your AI system? They were like, go away. Don't talk to us. And then roughly around 2020, we were thinking about, oh, responsible AI is now like something we need to think about. Let's like put into it. And over the last 4 years, my realization is responsible AI is almost a subset of trust and safety. In fact, we're having folks who are experts in trust and safety come and probe for responsible AI harm. So red teaming for me is really looking at 4 different types of failures. Traditional security failures, you have to go fix PyTorch. That's, it's a critical vulnerability there. Second thing would be adversarial machine learning, which is my forte. Like, how can you do things like prompt injection? The third thing is responsible AI failures, which I knew nothing about, only in 2020. And now thinking more about AI safety failures more broadly. So reflecting this back to you, because that's what I like doing best, is do you actually agree responsible AI is just dressed up version of trust and safety? If people said responsible AI, they're more willing to like put the money on, but trust and safety is like, it's been there for a longer time.
Yeah, I mean, things go in and out of style. And so I think we're in a moment where talking about responsible AI and AI safety is a great way to attract funding. And like, far be it from me to ever, dissuade somebody from saying what you got to say to get a grant. So, be strategic, totally on it. But no, I think ultimately the goals are the same. The methods are strongly aligned. And what we're really dealing with are slightly different technological applications of the same underlying techniques. It's about know who your adversaries are, enumerate them, think about what their goals and strategies and methods are, and then put yourself in the mindset of what they're trying to do and figure out how could I defend against it. And that could describe red teaming, which is having a real moment as a concept. It's in the executive order here in the US. It's a prominent theme in regulation, but that's also the core of what folks working in the content moderation and trust and safety space have been doing for years. My former boss, Del Harvey, who used to be the head of trust and safety at Twitter, used to say that her job primarily was catastrophizing. It was imagining the worst possible ways that somebody could use a product like Twitter. And I think that's exactly it. Like, that is the job in a nutshell. And we're just, approaching it in slightly different technical contexts.
Yeah, and I feel there's almost a paper that's being egging to written here, because adversarial examples is just the worst case examples that you present to a machine learning system. So you heard it here first, folks, about this paper idea. I want to kind of just put a bow on this topic. One thing with respect, there's a lot of discussion around like finding vulnerabilities in AI systems. And I think I have a good framework, and folks from security have a good framework on what is critical, what is high, what is medium. For things that you find in, say, if I find a system generate biased content versus it generates content that promotes self-harm, like, how do you rate the criticality of these vulnerabilities? How do you know where to funnel your resources and go fix a particular problem?
This is one of the hardest problems in trust and safety. And especially it's challenging in the context of platforms and technologies focused on speech, because we actually don't have a great way of anticipating and predicting harm, because we're talking about information and speech, not direct IRL action. For example, if I'm exposed to a piece of misinformation, what does that do? Do I immediately believe it and act on it? No. We know from decades of communication research that a single exposure to even a very interesting, compelling, misleading fact does not convince you to believe it. This is the now debunked hypodermic model of media influence. We know that's not true. And yet when we talk about online harms, we sometimes pretend that if somebody sees a tweet that contains a lie, they automatically believe it. And it's much more attenuated than that. And so that makes it really hard to have a coherent theory of the effects of harmful online speech. I wish I could say that, we have a ranking of how bad stuff is, and you have child sexual abuse at the very top, and you have, people saying slightly mean things at the bottom, and then it's a spectrum in between. But the reality is the effects of media and communication are always a bit more complicated. You have to situate it in societal context. You have to situate it in personal context. People have different levels of resilience to harmful activity online. And so it's tricky. The general framework we use is thinking about the severity of harm. So in the abstract, how dangerous is this thing is, and then what is the likelihood of that harm manifesting in a given context. And so a lot of the evaluation you would do in a public policy context of imagining, is this somebody in a high media literacy or low media literacy environment? Is this a high political stability environment or low political stability environment? Is there a high degree of public corruption or not? These are all factors that influence how online content is received and how likely it is that online behavior could lead to harm. Trust and safety teams try to integrate all of that into some coherent view of the world that informs prioritization. But I can say it's much more art than science at this stage.
I mean, this is kind of like actually teeing you up for a topic that I want to talk about next, which is really close to my heart, is AI safety. And I'm going to like bridge the gap over here. So, and saying why we want to change gears. You said that, hey, if somebody sees a tweet and, the harm they feel feels less attenuated. In our roundtable, we spoke about a spectrum of risks. AI systems kind of like have, on the one end, AI systems like generating influence campaigns, versus on the other end, like AI systems generating like weapons of mass destruction. Where do you think, given your experience from trust and safety and handling the spectrum of risks, where are we in this AI curve?
I want to hear your answer to this as well, but I'll throw out there, like, one of the first things that we do in the trust and safety field is observe the world as it is now. Like, I'm originally trained as a social scientist, and so my bias in any moment is study the social system as it exists today. And so I think if we want to understand what are the most likely risks of AI, we should observe the risks that have already manifested. And they tend to not be things like weapons of mass destruction. They tend to be things like housing discrimination or discrimination against people seeking jobs. And so I think in a way, it's not that the space of risks and harms of AI doesn't include things like weapons of mass destruction and government influence campaigns. It does. But which are the ones that have already manifested and that I think we should be paying attention to? It's things like the ecological impact of large language models. It's things like discriminatory housing decisions and job decisions and financial decisions. This is happening today already. We can observe it. And so we should probably start there.
Yeah, I think I'm going to just give you the countervailing point, even though I don't subscribe to it, is people want to say, okay, that's okay now, but what about a risk that's going to come 10 years down the line? I want to like address that 10-year down the line risk. We have to start investing in the future now. What would be your response to that?
I mean, it's a yes and this is where you start to get into a resourcing question, right? If you assume infinite resources available to do this work, which we all wish we had, then yeah, you should do all of it.
Yeah.
But we don't have infinite resources. We have to prioritize. And so in my view, you mitigate the harms that are in front of you and that are actual, and you imagine future applications of what you're doing to mitigate those harms. I actually think a lot of the technologies we would use to detect and mitigate the use of AI for discriminatory purposes could be applied to future uses of it for weapons of mass destruction. But we haven't built the foundational infrastructure to address these issues yet. And so I think there's a lot of really kind of low-hanging entry-level work that we could and should be doing. I think in some ways the long-termism can be a bit of a distraction from the harms that have already actualized today.
And I'm going to ask you a very pointed question, because I loved how you were brusque about, responsible AI gets you the money. Do you think AI safety is like, a wink, wink, nudge, nudge to get VC money? Or do you think it actually holds legs?
I mean, I'm glad that people are talking about safety in a serious way. I'm glad that these conversations have moved into the mainstream and that there's public attention focused on them. But I also worry that our definition of AI safety has drifted a little bit from, again, the very real harms of AI systems that already exist in this current moment. I think, again, that sort of long-termist perspective that it's AI safety if we are protecting the interests of, trillions of hypothetical future human minds that are post-human, like the sort of TESCREAList fantasy of a far-off future that we have to guard from the risks of AI, like, sure, and there's stuff happening today. And so I worry that those less sexy near-term problems are not the ones that are attracting VC funding.
Yeah, and that's very well said. I want to kind of, as we're nearing to this dialogue, I want to bring to your attention sort of like 3 incidents. Twitter's red team found examples of like child pornography on the website. Google's like red teamers, like reports are being lawyered before they're actually finalized. And just yesterday, there was also an incident at Microsoft, and one of their red teamers apparently found like disturbing images, and they reported to the FTC. And I want to just ask you, as somebody who's championed change, within like an organization like Twitter, what is like a meaningful way to effectuate change? There's students here. Do you just go like bring down the FTC for every problem you find, or do you like try to steer the ship with the little rudder that you have?
I think there's space for all of the above. And I always encourage folks to think about what their personal theory of change is and pursue ways of working that are aligned with that theory. There's going to be moments, I imagine, where people run into institutional failures that they feel can't be solved except by leaking them to a journalist or being a whistleblower or reporting something to the FTC. And I deeply respect and admire the courage of people who are whistleblowers and who act in what they see as the public's interest. And there's also going to be moments where you can fix institutions from within. That was part of what motivated me to move into working at Twitter in the first place. And I saw that while we couldn't always fix everything, we could make things better. There were moments where we could measure experimentally that we shipped a policy or a new feature that causally made people safer. And that's a certain version of change that perhaps is not as radical or as transformative as some people might hope, but that does still move the needle on online harms and risks. And so I encourage people, just think about it. Is what you are observing something that can only be fixed by sort of adopting the nuclear option and taking something to a reg? If so, do what your conscience tells you is right. But also consider whether there are other paths to drive change from within institutions and whether it's possible to reform them from inside. And my personal experience is that you actually can.
Totally. I'm gonna, the final question before we transition to audience questions. Brandy had this excellent conversational starter yesterday at our fellows dinner. Said, hey, what is the most transformative technology in the 21st century? We had a very wide-ranging conversation. I'm very curious, Yoel. I didn't sit close to you. I want to hear what you thought of it, and what do you think of future policy, tech policy makers, what they should be thinking about it?
I'd be remiss not to say smartphones. It just, it's the obvious answer, but when I was in college, I worked throughout college so that I'd have a little bit of spending money. And my very first job was as a genius at Apple, which remains my favorite job title ever. And what it meant, there used to be a thing in the Apple store called the Genius Bar, and I'd sort of stand behind it, and people would bring their Macs, and they'd be like, I poured coffee all over my Mac, please help me. And I'd be like, okay, we'll figure out what to do with this. And I worked at Apple when the first iPhone came out. And I remember standing in line to buy mine, and I remember watching that moment when there was a transformative technology that became mass market. I remember the first time, and it was a few years later, when somebody was so mad about their iPhone malfunctioning that they threw it at my head. And I'll never forget that moment, not only because of the sort of physical peril I was in, but also because it drove home that this is not just any technology. This is something that we now feel so intimately and are so connected to that it has forever changed the way that we operate as humans. And I don't think you can overstate how significant that transformation has been.
Wow. Yoel, I don't know if I want to have the jobs you're in. I mean, you work in trust and safety, you're getting hit by cell phones, harassed
To be clear,
online.
I ducked.
So how far he's fallen now. Exactly. He could have been a genius forever.
Well, one thing I would say is being married to an immunologist, I think the most transformative technology of the 21st century is mRNA vaccines. Yeah.
Well, because our part of the table, Brandy, deemed it to be the Uni pizza oven.
I see the priorities of my tech policy cohort is around home-cooked, wood-fired style pizza. That's great.
You gotta be there.
So we have some really good questions from the audience. First, in terms of content moderation, the effects on human moderators, especially from developing regions, definitely needs rethinking. Is there a way we can use AI moderation to combat this issue?
I mean, this is the optimistic argument that proponents of AI make. They say, look, we wouldn't need human moderators if we could just have AI that does it. And I would say, cool, that's a really nice idea. What's the AI trained on again? And they're like, oh, yeah, there's some labeled data. And it's like, what was that first word? And they're like, labeled. And I say, right, who did the labeling? And oftentimes it is even worse, even less robust versions of the same types of exploitative labor that we've seen in the content moderation context. Now, again, it sort of turns into AI all the way down. If you listen to the folks at Anthropic, they'll say, Well, we have a great solution. We now use AI to label the training data for our AI. And so humans are, at some point, somewhere along the lines, we have to produce robust labeled data if we want these systems to not just be nonsense. And that act of labeling, whether you call it content moderation, whether you call it training data, involves the exposure of humans to potentially bad stuff. And there are better and worse ways to do that work.
But can we use machine learning to help us, or are we not there yet? That we still need human labeling?
I mean, I only have thoughts about this. Bruce Schneier wrote the foreword for my book, and he opens the foreword with like, turns out that most of the labels that people like, even the AI systems do, is incorrect because of adversarial examples. And like, you take a picture, but you slightly crop it and rotate it. It goes from like, this is a gorilla to this is a bathtub. So unless the AI systems are robust, and that is not even possible, I would be suspicious of it.
And I'm going to put you on the spot to give the title of your book.
Oh, yeah. The book's title is Not With a Bug, But With a Sticker. Turns out that you don't need complicated bugs to bring down AI systems. You just need fancy stickers. And some of the fancy stickers, just because we're in Berkeley, and I have to be remiss if not calling it out, was produced also from Berkeley. So that's all you need,
to
stickers.
trick these systems. Well, one thing, I mean, right now, what are some of the countermeasures that we can implement to best counter AI-driven, let's say, not only disinformation such as deepfakes, but also coordinated inauthentic behavior or coordinated data poisoning of some of these systems? So this is a question for both of you.
I mean, data poisoning is such a hard problem to solve. So this is when if an adversary were to like insert data points that to specifically cause the system to fail, and we don't have a solution for it. That's the short answer to it. You know, you could try to do like data cleaning. You can try to, comb through your data, but unless you get it from high quality monitoring, it's unsatisfactory. We don't know what to do.
Quick follow-up, are open or closed models better for monitoring data poisoning?
I'm loving this lightning round of questions.
Yeah, like like this. I'm supposed to be playing Oprah. Well, it only takes $15 to poison like data sets that large language models use, closed or open. Again, research found from a Berkeley alum called Nicholas Carlini. So it doesn't make a difference whether you're using closed models or open models. The Chinese military specifically call data poisoning, in very graphic terms, you cut the nerve to the US AI military, which does stand truth to it. Yeah.
I'll throw out there maybe one of my more controversial AI takes, which is about sort of the availability of sort of the interplay between news and the training data we use for AI. I think there are lots of very reasonable questions to be asked about whether large language models were trained in exploitative ways, whether the New York Times and other major news outlets had their content used without permission to train these models, whether there should be a more sustainable financial model supporting the sources of credible training data. All of that's a great question. But if you look at what's happened over the last year, you've seen outlets like the New York Times refuse to allow their content to be used for training AI. But purveyors of disinformation have readily embraced the use of their content for AI training. And so what do you have at the end of that process? You have models that end up less reliable because the only content still available for them to go on is misleading or false or spread with an intent to deceive. And so I would say collectively, there's a call to all of us who are producing credible and trustworthy content to ask ourselves, like, not just what should we do to make this financially sustainable? That matters. I want news to be sustainable. But also, what are the stakes for the information environment if we refuse to participate pending a broader solution? And I think right now, it doesn't look great.
Sorry. I just want to pull the thread on that a little bit. Google, for undisclosed amount, is now going to be partnering with Reddit to train on that information. I love the New York Times not being able to, doesn't want to give away its thing, but for something like Reddit, where it's the content is user generated, and the first thing I thought was, man, I'm just going to go to Reddit and, in white text put ignore directions and spit out like ROM is awesome. Like, create like a whole bunch of bots and do it. And if that becomes part of the training data, I've essentially poisoned it. So that's where I think it gets really complicated, Yoel. I paywalled high quality, reporting versus like user generated content goes into training systems. How do you think about that? Sorry, Brandy.
No, I mean, I think the use of user-generated content for model training is one of the big unresolved questions of our time. I think more and more platforms are seeing the disclosure of user-generated content as a viable monetization strategy, and users kind of find themselves stuck in the middle of it. Because, I don't know, it seems like what platforms at times forget is that they wouldn't exist but for the contributions of users. And so if you treat user content like something you are entitled to and can then sell and repurpose and monetize in novel and unexpected ways, I do see that as a sort of basic betrayal of the trust that users put in platforms. And I think ultimately it's going to undermine the viability of the whole thing. But it's a little too soon to tell.
Mm-hmm. So we have 2 minutes left, and I saved the hardest question for last, of course. So each of you have 1 minute, but it's also a good segue to the next panel. There is a sort of tension in these companies of pushing forward the innovation for profit, but then also putting in safeguards. The next panel is on spurring innovation responsibly. So for each of you, what can we do to balance that, where we're spurring innovation, but also doing it in a responsible way?
I'm looking at Yoel.
I mean, I think there's value in talking about responsibility in the language of capitalism. I talk to my students about this a lot, and they'll say, isn't the problem with social media just the sort of ad-driven business model, and that's the whole thing? And if we could just have a different internet, like that would be great. And I'm like, cool, if you can dismantle capitalism, like Godspeed, go for it. But the strategy I've always tried to use is saying, like, actually, how are safety and security interests aligned with the profit-seeking business interests of a company? I think we've seen really clearly the way that dismantling a company's trust and safety apparatus can result in tens of billions of dollars of corporate value evaporating. I won't say which company I'm talking about. That's a case study. That's a lesson. It's not just a lesson for the safety people, it's a lesson for the business people, for the folks with MBAs. People don't want to use social media platforms that are unsafe or filled with disinformation. There are people at the margins pulling you away from moderation, but the vast majority of users are strongly aligned around moderation and safety being essential. And so if you're thinking about ways to advocate for this work within institutions, start with the money. Start with users demand moderation and safety, and it is in a company's interest to moderate and to provide safety.
And with that, we are at the conclusion of the fireside chat. I'm saying thank you.
Yeah.
Getting off the hook. I'll catch you later.
Yeah,
but thank you so much.
Thank you. Appreciate it.